Well, hello and welcome to the Babylonian podcast. I am Michael and I'm thrilled that you are here. In this season of the Babylonian podcast, we're exploring all of the New Testament Apocrypha. Well, maybe not in all. Either way, you can find our notes on all the New Testament Apocrypha, what we talk about here on the podcast episode, and even more, either with the link in the show notes below or by going to our website, thebabylonian.com. With that, let's actually look at them, shall we? With scholars, sages, and the scriptures, let's Bible on. All right, we're back in the New Testament Apocrypha today, continuing to trudge through the Infancy Gospels. In the last episode, in the Protoevangelium of James, at the beginning of that, we kind of go over a brief explanation of what an Infancy Gospel is there. And besides the Protoevangelium of James that we talked about in the last episode, this Infancy Gospel that we're going to be talking about today, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, along with the Protoevangelium of James, is likewise one of the most influential infancy gospels. Not only in its own time, as you'll see with all the other infancy gospels, they have basis. They're all influenced and taking stories directly from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and or the Protoevangelium of James. So these are like the two.
Infancy Gospel of Thomas is the notorious one. Like, this is the spicy one that people hear about. This one is one that we can't do a series on without actually mentioning.
Yes. This is like Protoevangelium of James is like the good cop infancy gospel, and this is like the bad cop infancy gospel. And they happen to be married, and they made a bunch of baby infancy gospels, which are all the other infancy gospels with some traits of one and some of the other. So yes, that's a perfect. This is a pretty popular one even today, even just like the Protoevangelium of James. So I think this one might be more popular. You said you had heard of the Protoevangelium of James last time, I think, right? Have you heard of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas? Do you know anything about this before we start?
Well, my knowledge, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is one where Jesus does a lot of miracles. And that's the big thing, is he does a lot of miracles. And I think with my extremely limited knowledge of Islam, I think Muhammad might reference the Infancy Gospel of Thomas with the birds. Like, I think Jesus makes birds come out of his hand or something like that, or turns like little clay things in like birds and makes them into alive. And so that's what I know.
Yes. Yeah. Those are the most famous parts about it. Jesus is this like crazy little kid with divine powers in this infancy gospel, and he makes clay into birds, and that is also found in the Quran, which definitely was taken from this infancy gospel. Yeah, that's perfect.
The illustration you used last week or one of the previous episodes was that it was like Jack. Jesus is a little Jack from The Incredibles. He has a lot of powers. It's a little bit uncontrolled, or we might not know what to do with it, but he's just flexing all over the place. And there's a whole lot of people who are older and might not have the competency to handle this powerful being.
Yes, exactly. That's the image that came to my mind. Yeah, that's a good analogy for today of what this infancy gospel is like. And yeah, another good thing to preface this conversation with is that, like we talked about in the first episode, introducing the New Testament Apocrypha, just because this is a New Testament Apocrypha, actually, specifically because this is a New Testament Apocrypha, we should take things with extra grains of salt. And so this was a particularly popular early New Testament Apocrypha, but this is being circulated around lay people that aren't as informed about orthodoxy. Some people are specifically heretics and are trying to pass on their own beliefs, heretical beliefs, through New Testament Apocrypha like propaganda. So we're reading this text, but as we saw in the Protoevangelium of James, we get some New Testament Apocrypha that are really good. They're epic. They're great. They're maybe more like the Chosen. And then we get some, like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, that, just like how we have media today that might not portray Christ in a great way. Like, is it called Jesus Christ Superstar or The Last Supper? I think there's this. Anyways, there's this. Within the past 20 or 30 years, there was this movie kind of like mocking and making fun of Jesus at the Last Supper and such. So either way, this is media that's being passed along. Yeah, these we can get an insight into what some people were thinking. It might not. Many of the times it's going to be unorthodox Christians. Sometimes it will be Orthodox Christians. So that's just a good, especially good thing to preface before this infancy apocrypha gospel, because it has a lot of things that just are completely incongruent with the canonical gospels. So yeah. Anyways, even though not so many people know too many details of this apocrypha, there's still quite a bit that's, at least I feel like, somewhat passed around today, like Jesus making sparrows from clay, or Jesus going around and being a menacing little kid. That all comes from this New Testament apocrypha. Now, in the last episode in the Protoevangelium of James, I also noted how one distinguishing factor from apocryphal and canonical literature is that the vast majority of the time that apocryphal literature is recounting a large story, when it gets to a more scandalous story, it has two things that it will tend to do. Not always do, but the vast majority of the time, if it comes to a scandalous story, it's either going to rewrite it and make it look like the good guy had good motives, and was confused, or what they did was actually good, but you just need to hear it from the perspective of this apocryphal text, or it will just cleanse the story. It won't talk about the story at all. So if you're reading like pseudepigrapha on the Old Testament, for example, we have one text called Jubilees. This is just a quick example for this, is when it talks about, it's recounting the whole story of Genesis and the first part of Exodus. And when it talks about Jacob and him lying to his father to steal Esau's birthright, it has God tell Rebecca to have Jacob lie so that he can steal a birthright. So it gives, as a reader, when you get to that part in Exodus, because you've read Jubilees, you're like, oh, okay, you can make better sense of it. There's not as much tension in the story, and characters aren't as dynamic. Now, with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, this is completely and totally different. And because the vast majority of infancy gospels have a lot of influence from this gospel, they also pick up on this too. And so I would say this is probably the one exception that I can think of that I found in all like apocryphal pseudepigraphal literature, where in their own context, the people are writing stories that are scandalous for the main righteous character, good guy. So yeah, that's just something interesting to note. But yeah, with that, let's jump into the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. One last note. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is not, even though both of these are very famous apocryphal gospels, it is not the Gospel of Thomas. Those are different. So another very famous text that we are going to get to and talk about later, totally different. Infancy Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Thomas, totally and completely different. So, with that, so some background information on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The translation that I'm reading from doesn't note the date for this text, but when I looked it up, it said it was around, I think it was like early or mid 2nd or 3rd century. I think 2nd century. So this is a pretty early text. This would be written around the same time as about like the Protoevangelium of James as well. The claimed author in this text, and remember, this is also a pseudepigraphon, so it's attributing its writing to somebody who didn't necessarily write it, but it attributes it to Thomas, of course, in 3 manuscripts. However, in one manuscript, it does mention James as being the other author. So this is really interesting. I was thinking, you might ask, why does one manuscript have James as the author? So Thomas, his name is Judas Thomas, but he's best known as just Thomas today. In the canonical Gospels, Judas Thomas has a nickname. He's called Didymus. Now, Thomas is the Aramaic word for twin, and Didymus is the Greek word for twin. So early on, especially more heretical sects And I mean, this is really falling outside of orthodoxy because Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, specifically just Jesus. But early heretical sects would believe that Thomas was the twin of Jesus. Maybe it could be passed off as spiritual. There's no explanation of him having a divine conception in any infancy gospels, but because he has the name Didymus, the title Didymus in the canonical gospels, they take him to be the twin of Jesus. And then James is Jesus's half brother, or in some traditions he's a cousin, or he's Jesus's legal brother. But either way, you can see the reason why one manuscript has James as the sibling, and then, the vast majority have Thomas. If these are his siblings, then they grew up with him. They knew about these stories from when he was young. And so that's what is supposedly giving it its authority. Now, from an Orthodox perspective, not as much talking about the apocryphal gospels, but I kind of looked it up just to check, because I got curious. I was like, so what could the name Didymus mean from an Orthodox perspective for Christians who, believe Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit and just him, hypostatic union? Didymus could be taken as, it seems that sometimes it's a proper name. So it could be that sometimes people called him a Greek name, Didymus, and sometimes people called him by his Aramaic name, Thomas. Like, that's the same thing with Paul and Saul. Saul is Paul's Hebrew name that he even uses, I think once, maybe twice, after he converts to Christianity. It's not that he has a total name swap. There's a time in Acts where it refers to him as Saul, so that's his Hebrew name. And then he also has Paul, which is his Greek name. But the reason he goes by Paul for the vast majority of the time after is because he's the apostle to the Gentiles. So yeah, that's one thing, is it could, and Thomas is also a proper name, just like it is in English today. So Didymus could just be his Greek proper name, or he could be somebody else's twin, and we're just not told whose twin. But there's nothing in the canonical gospels that hints at Thomas being related to Jesus at all. It seems that none of Jesus's brothers, half brothers, or siblings were a part of the 12 disciples. So, well, no, they just clearly weren't. So yeah, either way, that's a little side point that I think is helpful. As I was looking into that, I think that's a helpful explanation for others. So this text, Infancy Gospel of Thomas, is Gnostic. It has some Gnostic and Manichaean influence. It comes from Syria, and it was most likely written in Greek, perhaps Syriac. And
what is Manichaean influence? Who are the Manichaeans?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Manichaeans are pretty similar to Gnostics. Honestly, I couldn't really make the distinction that much. It is a dualistic sect, similar to Gnosticism, in that spiritual things are good and physical things are not good. I don't know the nuanced differences between them, but the Manichaeans are, for example, St. Augustine, the heretical cult that St. Augustine comes out of. They're also, I think, about the only other thing that I'm confident about is that they believe they're very deterministic. They're deterministic and dualistic. So yeah, so this is mostly, and I didn't really sense a whole lot of dualism in here. I'm not sure what aspects of it are Gnostic. There are some parts that are a little bit more esoteric, and we'll talk about those when we get to them. But the compiler and translator of the edition that I have says they're Gnostic and Manichaean, J.K. Eliot. So, but yeah, good question. Yeah. So this is referred to, so we have multiple people talking about some Gospel of Thomas. We're not sure if it's this Infancy Gospel of Thomas, some other work that doesn't exist anymore, or the other Gospel of Thomas, because it doesn't necessarily have the same name in the first centuries of its existence as it does today. But depending on whether or not these church fathers were referring to this text or another Gospel of Thomas, Cyril of Jerusalem, Hippolytus, the Second Council of Nicaea, and the Stichometry of Nicephorus and Origen might all have referred to this text. Again, that doesn't mean that they referenced it or were quoting it to back up some argument, but they talked about it in one way or another. As these being church fathers, they're probably all condemning it. So as for names, the original names for this text, we have it called The Account of Thomas the Israelite Philosopher Concerning the Childhood of the Lord. Another name is The Childhood of Jesus According to Thomas. The Book of the Holy Apostle Thomas Concerning the Life and Childhood of the Lord. The Childhood of our Lord Jesus Christ. So either way, all these titles set this book apart from the Gospel of Thomas by making sure that you know that it's about the childhood events. So even early on, they're trying to distinguish the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Thomas so you don't get these mixed up. So yeah, and again, this is not the same thing as the Gospel of Thomas that's found at Nag Hammadi, different thing. And there are multiple different variants of this apocryphal gospel account. And so we'll be exploring some of the most interesting of those manuscript differences. But without further ado, let's jump into it and look at this text. So the text opens up by talking in the first person point of view as if it's Thomas. It says, "I, Thomas, the Israelite, announce and make known to you all, brothers from among the Gentiles, the mighty childhood deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ, which he did when he was born in our land. The beginning is as follows." So already, well, one thing just to set the stage for this is Jesus is probably 30 when he starts his actual ministry in the canonical gospels and all the canonical gospels. And other than that, the only story that we get of him before he was 30 years old of him actually doing anything other than like being born is in the gospel according to Luke when he's 12 and him and his parents go to the temple. His parents forget him there. And then, they come back and he says, "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" And that's all we have is that one story from when he was 12.
So we got to like fill in this gap of this missing. What happened? What happened to this person before he turned 30? That's a lot of years. So Thomas, or the author here, it's like, we got to fill in that gap. We got to inform people. I guess we also do have the Matthew and Luke accounts of his birth, but that's not, Jesus isn't running around doing things at that point. He's a baby. And so the active participants would probably be like shepherds.
Yeah, exactly. The only story where Jesus is doing something as a young person is in that one single account in Luke. And the interesting thing, I was also thinking about this today, and I was like, oh, I think this might have been an influence on this infancy gospel account. This is going to have a recounting of that same scenario in Luke. But I think one of the key verses in Luke that this was inspired by, and I'm not saying that it did a good job on its inspiration, but after that account in Luke, where Jesus is left behind at the temple, it says that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature. And so I think the main point of this infancy gospel is to show Jesus's divinity, but also when I think their assumption is, okay, so he's immature and he doesn't know how to use his powers because he hasn't grown, and it says he grew in wisdom and stature after that account at the temple, if that makes sense.
Sure. So you're saying that the learning there is actually specifically learning how to control his powers, which has I don't know, I'm thinking about this right now. It has somewhat of a Nestorian vibe to it.
Can you explain Nestorianism?
Yeah, so Nestorianism is a heresy, or what Christians deem to be a heresy in the 5th century, I think, in which, Nestorianism basically says that Mary is the mother of the Christ, not Mary is the mother of God. So essentially, what Cyril, his opponent, argues against him is that to say that Mary is the mother of Christ and not the mother of God. I think Nestorius was trying to be cautious and not say like, how can a human being be the mother of a god? But what Cyril is kind of argues is, you're saying that he was only human when he was inside of Mary's womb, means that there's like two separate entities, and that human existed apart from his nature of being God. And so he wasn't fully God when he was born, which means that there's like a separation between those two natures rather than them actually being unified and one. And so why I say it has like a Nestorian-ish vibe is because it seems to imply that there's like a human nature that has like control and sentience, and like, okay, I'm human, I get it. But there's a lack of an awareness, like, oh, I am God. And so he's figuring out how to be God. What does that mean and stuff? Instead of the word being eternally existent from the beginning. Does that make sense? So that's why I was like,
yeah.
If this divine nature feels unnatural in some way, that doesn't mean that the word existed forever. And so Christians believe, or at least if you adhere to the thought process of Cyril, and I guess the church, because the church ended up long-term, it's kind of a complicated situation, but long-term agreeing with Cyril, you would say that the second person of the Trinity was always God, and yet also was born of Mary and became human in her womb, right? At conception by the Holy Spirit. So that's kind of why I say it has a Nestorian-ish vibe, because it's saying that the divine nature is a little bit weird for him and he's got to figure it out.
Yeah, that's good. I think so. This text does, the one thing that this text does really well is make it very explicit that Jesus is fully divine when he is a child. But I guess it's trying to portray him as immature and not knowing. So I guess in that sense, that it seems to be assuming that maybe as a human, he, like, his human and divine nature have some type of separation or aren't fully connected, or I guess at the beginning it's somehow, I don't know, there seems to be some confusion of the natures here, though, which, like you said, I think is at least
It seems Nestorian.
yes, yeah,
Would you add
yeah,
anything
exactly.
to that? I think it seems Nestorian, and I think we'd also say this is pre-Nestorius. I don't think so. It's not that this was influenced by Nestorius's thought process, but alas, it seems to coincide with some of the thought processes of Nestorius and any of us who might just think, oh, well, how is Jesus God and human, and is trying to think about that and hasn't thought as much on the unity of those two natures.
Good word. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, so this, it's trying to play with the tension of Jesus figuring out how to rightly use these, and how Jesus interacts and works and does things before Luke explicitly mentions that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. So I mentioned how there's multiple different accounts. For example, in one of the Latin manuscripts, it says that when Jesus is 2, an angel tells Joseph to flee to Egypt until Herod is dead. So, they go off to Egypt. On their way through a cornfield, Jesus takes some corn and he sets them on fire and then he eats them. So Jesus is making popcorn with his divine powers. And then when he's 3, in the middle of the city, he throws some corn around a teacher so that some birds will come over the teacher and fight to get the corn on the teacher's lap. So then Jesus laughs at the teacher and then explains what he did. He tells it to the teacher, and then the teacher gets angry. He throws him and his mother out of the city, and then an angel tells Mary to go with her family to Nazareth. So this is similar to the story. It has some parts of the story of Matthew, and then it expands on it, the part the story in Matthew where the angel of the Lord tells Joseph that he should go to Egypt until Herod is dead, and then they go back to Nazareth. And I guess this kind of gives another explanation for why they leave Egypt, is that Jesus made this teacher mad by throwing corn at him.
Well, a prophet is never accepted in their hometown.
Yeah. Well, this is Egypt, though.
Yeah, no, but 3-year-old Jesus, prophet, they're not going to have a good time in their hometown. So even if he's 3 years old, it's more of a joke.
Okay, I got you. I'll roll with it. But this is 3-year-old little boy already ticking off teachers and eating popcorn. Yeah, I don't think feeding your 3-year-old child popcorn is a great application point. But yeah, so that's in a Latin manuscript, and then it continues on, and it says it has an angel tell Mary to go to Nazareth, where it says that her father has a house. And then some manuscripts say that it's Joseph's father's house. So it might have been that Mary or Joseph's parents had a home in Jerusalem and Joseph had a home in Bethlehem. And so they moved quickly between the two places in Jesus's youth, which would account for why in Luke, Jesus is circumcised in Jerusalem on his 8th day after being born, but then an angel of the Lord tells Joseph to go to Egypt until Herod is dead. I think it's like, okay, I guess that makes sense. It is pretty hard to make sense of that different, why are they moving all the way out to Jerusalem? And then I can't remember if Matthew says that they were in Bethlehem when the angel of the Lord tells them to flee to Egypt. But it does seem like Luke is saying that Jesus was there in Jerusalem on his 8th day being circumcised, which makes sense. But then it has Joseph in Bethlehem for the census when Jesus is born and when he's told to flee. So make do with it what you will, but that could be a somewhat decent point or apocryphal edition, apologetic apocryphal edition. So those are the two Latin editions. And now those aren't, I think those are later editions, not part of the original text, more adaptations. But either way, we're going back, and we'll still continue to look at some of the different editions from different manuscripts as we get to them, if they're interesting. But we're going to be sticking mostly to the original text now. So anyways, the first part in the original text, it opens up with that famous scene like you talked about. Jesus is so young Jesus, he's 5 years old, at least in some manuscripts. So he's a kindergartner, and he's making some pools of clean water, and he uses the clay that's by these pools of water, and he turns them into sparrows. But it's on the Sabbath. So some other kid snitches to Joseph, his father, and then Jesus has to go and shoo away the birds. So this very odd story. I think if I was to give it what I think is probably more credit than is due, but perhaps this is what the author was intending, is at least for the sparrows part, we see Jesus doing something similar to God's creative act of creating humans from the clay. That's the best I can do with that. But then even if that's the case, then it kind of, I guess, lowers, at least for me. Well, I was going to say it lowers humanity and makes, sparrows
Because
are
we're
the same.
both made from the clay.
Yeah, but now that I think of it, I'm pretty sure Genesis 2 does say. So maybe that's on me. Maybe I'm wrong for that. But yeah, either way,
I don't know that Genesis says that the animals were made from the clay.
Let me check real quick.
That's worth checking out. And I think the being made out of the clay might be in the Genesis 2 story. Maybe not.
It is for the human. Yeah, it is. Yeah. So, and actually, okay. So just checked. Genesis 2:19 does say that the Lord God formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky.
Oh, okay.
So it doesn't say that he used clay. The standout feature for humanity would be the breath of life, I would say. So yeah, perhaps that could be a decent connection that this author is trying to make, because as we will see going forward, Jesus, like this author is, the good thing about this text is the author is very clear about Jesus being divine even from this young age. So yeah, and as you mentioned, these are also found in the Quran, which definitely had influence, at least indirectly, from this Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So we all know Annas from the canonical Gospels. This is the high priest along with Caiaphas that accuses Jesus and has him crucified. So some son of the scribe Annas, it calls him the scribe Annas, so I'm assuming this is the same Annas. This son is placing branches from a willow in some water that Jesus had just miraculously cleaned. So Jesus gets angry. He curses him. And then he says that he will wither up and die like a branch, just like the branch that he pulled apart. So he gets angry at him for, needlessly pulling off that branch, and then tells him that he's going to die just like that branch. And so the kid just does, or sorry, he withers up and dies. So the parents are obviously not pleased with that. Instead of going and talking to their local law enforcement, like they should probably do, they go and they tell Jesus's father, Joseph, again. So we have these two instances. Jesus is using his powers to do something creative and fun. And I guess it's good. He's more clean water to drink from. And this kid is messing it up with this dirty branch. And so Jesus kind of takes revenge on this kid for, maybe a small playing around, I guess you could say it's like innocent tomfoolery or something. And Jesus just makes him wither up and die.
Which, that's kind of interesting if you think about it. Well, because Jesus's view of children in like Matthew 18, if anyone must be first, you must become like this child. But this Jesus has a little patience for kids. He's just like, oh, look, this kid dropped it in there. Well, simultaneously also, so that is a way that it's like very much against the gospel. However, it would also provide somewhat of a justification for, Annas to maybe be a little bit bitter at Jesus. This, set up the rivalry early, but
like with Annas,
because Annas and Caiaphas are going to crucify him later. So, and then maybe they got jealous when they saw Lazarus rise from the dead. They're like, oh well, he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, but he's going to kill my kid. I don't know. I mean, I feel like that part is obvious. The whole like picking the fight, that I think maybe the thing that might be slightly less obvious, or the way that it's very different from the Jesus we know, is the Jesus in the Bible, in the Gospels, or it's like cares for kids, puts a high value on childhood. And this kid, Jesus, when he's a kid, sees a kid do something pretty innocent and normal. It's like,
yeah, yeah. This Jesus is not the let the little children come to me. This Jesus is like, even if you're a child, I'm holding you to the same standard.
is that kid squashing a bug? Gets
You will be
Bring him here.
squashed like that bug. Yeah, we will see. I had the same suspicion, and I was just about to bring that up. I think that this is why this is trying to be an explanation for why Annas has a predisposition against Jesus in the canonical Gospels, because Jesus kills his son. We will see, however, as to the jealousy for Lazarus, we are going to come back to this story. You know, it tells other stories, and then it has a little side note that has implications for the story going forward, which is interesting. So, but yeah, I agree. I think that's probably what this author is trying to do. So yeah, that, Jesus he's a little bit overreactive, quite a bit overreactive. The kid is maybe hurting this tree, this non-sentient tree, and dirtying Jesus's water that he cleaned. That, it is nice to have clean water. He kind of overreacts. But next, some child runs and knocks Jesus on his shoulder. And so Jesus tells him he won't go any further on his way, and the kid falls down and dies. So that is probably quite a bit of an overreaction. This is not even like a tick for tack type of thing. This is kind of like this is really like, what is it, like swallowing a camel? Like, this is squatting in a gnat and swallowing a camel, right? This is pretty crazy. So
Jesus does notice when people touch him, right? Someone touched his robe and he noticed. This time, he was a lot less merciful and a lot less sweet.
Yeah, really. This kid is, like I said, he's like Jack. He's a monster in this infancy gospel. So anyways, these parents are complaining to Joseph. So Joseph is asking Jesus, why are you doing everything that you're doing? And so Jesus says that Joseph's words aren't actually his own words, but he's saying that these people are getting their just punishments. Jesus is giving them their just punishments. Then all these parents that have accused Jesus makes them all blind. And then Joseph, he's pretty upset by that, as a good parent would be. He pulls Jesus by the ear angrily. And then Jesus warns his dad, Joseph. He says, don't make me angry. So this is a pretty tense. I mean, if you're having a difficult time fathering, this is encouragement, but it's also like fictional, heretical encouragement. I don't really know what to say there.
Heretical encouragement.
What's that?
Heretical encouragement.
Heretical parenting encouragement. Yeah.
It's a reverse of the trope of the kid who gets in trouble, right? And the kid's in trouble and they're like, okay, we're going to avoid the parent, right? After you've done that thing and you're like, it's coming to you. So you're like keeping your head down. You're like, and then, your parent address, you're like, what? Joseph's probably doing the reverse, but when his kid's there, he's like, hi, Jesus, jumping up around and everything.
Yeah. This is like Jesus is telling Joseph, you have no power over me except the power that I have given to you, and I'm not giving it to you. I'm keeping that power for myself. Like, this is totally like black and white from Pontius, Jesus' encounter with Pontius Pilate, where he's being falsely accused and says nothing.
Yeah. Well, and also in Exodus 20, when Moses gives the 10 Commandments, he commands. Is it Exodus 20? He commands children to obey your parents. So you would expect as a kid growing up with the law that he would like have a respect for his parents. Obey your parents, respect your parents. One of those two. So
yeah,
kind of a little bit.
Honor your father and mother. Yeah. And as Paul notes, that's the first commandment that has a promise that your life will go long and well on the land as long as you do that. So yeah, and actually, I got to add this interesting thing because it's really good. But Philo of Alexandria, the first commentator on the Torah, says that there's actually 5 rules from the 10 commandments that have to do with honoring God and 5 that have to do with honoring people. And this is actually considered a law about honoring God because your parents represent the authority of God. So that's a pretty cool.
Interesting.
actually even ironic because this text is so emphatic both about Jesus being God and being divine, but also about him being a little punk to his parents and authority. So this gets taken to the next level when we get another iconic appearance or Easter egg. Zacchaeus sees Jesus rebuking Joseph, and he says, Jesus, you're pretty clever, but he tells Joseph to let him teach Jesus the Greek alphabet. And I'm actually really not familiar at all with ancient pedagogy in school and education and such. But I'm pretty sure this is pretty early for a lot of people. And another reminder is that education, even literacy, was more expensive and more for the elite. It wasn't common like everybody went to school like today. You mostly learned your father's trade.
Right. Not every fourth grader had to do a standardized test to move on to the next grade.
Yeah, exactly. But Zacchaeus sees something special in him, and he's like, let me teach this guy the Greek alphabet. So anyways, Zacchaeus is innocently, he's doing a good thing. He's trying to teach Jesus the alphabet. So he tries to teach him so Zacchaeus tries to teach Jesus to say alpha. And then he tries to tell him to say beta. And Jesus says, well, I'll say beta when you tell me what alpha even means. And then, Jesus goes on and he tells all these like allegories and tries to, explain the esoteric significance of alpha. In one manuscript, Jesus tells Zacchaeus that he knows more than him because he created the world and was before the ages. He tells him that if he thinks that's incredible, that he should wait till he sees him on the cross, and then Zacchaeus will believe him. Anyways, so Zacchaeus is like, whoa, am I? And he asks Joseph to take Jesus away. He says Jesus is powerful and he's mighty, and I think he might have even existed before the creation of the world. So this is a pretty explicit explanation of Jesus being divine and the pre-incarnate logos, which Jesus is being a punk, but
it's not the first time that people interact with God and want someone to go ahead and step in and communicate with God for them, right? Because when God gives the 10 Commandments, the people of Israel are like, whoa, they get scared. They're like, Moses, you go talk to them, right? And I guess in the same way. So it is similar in that sense, right? You've got the whole little, step away from, oh man, that's God. Zacchaeus is taking Jesus seriously in the way that the people of Israel took Yahweh seriously.
Yeah, I've heard different interpretations, like that God actually eventually wanted Israel to go up, and it's because of their fear that they told Moses to go up on their behalf when God's original intent and design was for all Israel to be there. And so God kind of makes the Levites kind of as like a compromise, the priestly class, because he tells them originally before the 10 Commandments that he wants them to be a kingdom of priesthood, but then a kingdom that is a priesthood, right? But then because of that, he kind of compromises, so to say. That's not a very good precise term, but he kind of meets them where they're at and makes the Levites. But
it has a similar reaction, right?
Yes, yeah, similar reaction to that for sure. Yeah, Zacchaeus is like, okay, yeah, maybe I don't really know the Greek alphabet as well as I thought I did. So yeah, that's and I was looking this up, and there are other sources, like from what I was seeing, it looks like this was something that may have even had an independent origin even before this Infancy Gospel of Thomas, or that it was found in other things that may not have necessarily been influenced by this. That's kind of interesting. I don't think that really adds any validity to it at all, this as being like a historically accurate story, but it's very interesting that that's one of the things that gets passed around. I think this is probably at least from my reading, not as a heretic expert at all, this is probably the closest thing that we're getting to like Gnostic, with Jesus just wanting an esoteric explanation of alpha and the alphabet and what the significance of all the different letters in that are. So anyways, the Jews, they console Zacchaeus, but Jesus, he laughs, and then he says, now let those who are yours bear fruit, and let the blind in heart see. I have come from above to curse them and to call them to the things above, as he who sent me ordained for your sakes. Then everyone who had been cursed by Jesus is healed, which presumably includes Annas' son and the one kid who had snitched on Jesus. that Jesus cursed. So those 2 kids that Jesus cursed. Presumably they're resurrected, but it just says that the people that he cursed are no longer under his curse anymore.
So Annas is not jealous of John the Baptist.
Or of Lazarus.
Of Lazarus,
right?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe not John the Baptist either, but he's not jealous of Lazarus.
Yeah, if anything, like, bro, did Jesus wait 4 days for your kid to be resurrected? Well, perhaps he waited even longer. Well, in which case maybe he is. But yeah, he might still be salty about Jesus killing his kid, though, I guess. That probably didn't put him on a good footing with him. And we also have Zacchaeus. We also have Zacchaeus here, which is interesting. He's like a kind-hearted teacher here who wants to give free tutoring to this kid, and he's not really that much of a wealthy, selfish, stealing tax collector like he is in the canonical gospels. So
yeah, but he's arrogant because he thinks he has something to teach God. He's arrogant because he's like, oh, look, well, there's God. Well, I can teach him because he's younger because he only sees that Jesus is human. He doesn't realize that he's been around for forever. And then he realizes, so maybe he's just really ageist,
Yeah, maybe.
Like once he realizes he's older, he's like, oh man, I have deep respect for that.
And then that's the real turnaround, is that whenever he sees Jesus, and Jesus is an adult, and Zacchaeus is, he's had some time to process, to talk with his counselor about family of origin things and work that all out. And now he's interested in learning from Jesus.
Woe is me, I'm only 35.
He was projecting his midlife crisis, and then, he sees Jesus made it through his midlife crisis with divine power, and he said, okay, yeah, this is certainly from before the beginning. This is nowhere in the middle of Jesus's life. Anyways, yeah, that's funny. That's good, interesting. So anyways, okay. Then we have another story where Jesus is playing with some kids on the second story of a house, and some kid falls off and dies. So the parents accuse Jesus of doing it. So Jesus, jumps out of the building, does what's natural. He goes to the kid who threw himself down and off the building and died. And he asks the kid, he says, hey, was I the person who killed you? And then the kid just resurrects from the dead and just says, oh no, actually you're the person who raised me from the dead. And then the parents worship Jesus. So even though Jesus resurrects the kid here, it's kind of for like a selfish motive of like, oh, I'm just going to show these authority, like what's what. So anyways, so interesting thing here is, Jesus, we have these 2 encounters where Jesus, at the very beginning, at least in the majority manuscripts, the critical edition will say, Jesus kills a kid for snitching on him. He kills a kid for running into him. And then what? Do you remember what the other thing was?
Well, did you mention the popcorn one?
Oh, that's not part of the. That's part of the Latin. I'm talking about the Greek manuscripts.
So there's the branch that fell into the water.
Yes, yeah, the branch. So he kills 3 kids, right? And then after that, he resurrects the 2 kids by taking away the curse, and then he resurrects a 3rd kid. And then in the middle of that is Zacchaeus trying to teach him. And that's actually like a longer narrative about Jesus explaining these things and telling Zacchaeus how he really doesn't know anything. So that's a nice little chiasm, which, if you don't know what a chiasm is, that's a poetic structure that's like A, B, C, B, A, where it is reflecting in upon the center to emphasize the center. So that's something interesting. And then there's other stories that I don't think are as significant, but they're interesting stories. And Jesus actually does he becomes a kinder person after these. He goes and his mother needs water, so he goes and he gets his cloak and brings water in his cloak. His father Joseph is a carpenter, and so he extends this board of wood for Joseph and makes it longer. James, his half brother James, gets bitten by a snake, and so he heals James. And yeah, he does other miracles. And then there's this other, the other half of it, which is not as significant or novel, is Jesus doing miracles. Again, it's 3 miracles, and then people try to teach Jesus, but find out they can't teach him, and then 3 more miracles. So it's 3 miracles. The first 3 are Jesus killing kids for ticking him off, and then Zacchaeus tries to teach him, and then 3 resurrections, and then 3 miracles, and then somebody trying to teach him, and then 3 miracles. So that's a little something interesting. At least this text is emphasizing Jesus's divinity. And then at the end, when Jesus is 12, Jesus and his parents go to Jerusalem for Passover, just like in Luke. But Jesus went back to Jerusalem as his parents traveled home. So in this story, it's not that he stayed home, or not that he stayed in Jerusalem because he needed to be in his father's house, but he is actually with his parents, and he's like, actually, I'm going to go back. So it's not that he wasn't worried about finding his parents and his parents couldn't find him and didn't look for him. It's that originally he was with his parents, and then he's like, yeah, actually, I'm going to go back. So for whatever reason, it changes that. And then his parents see that he's lost after traveling for a day, and then they search for him, and they find him in Jerusalem listening to teachers and asking questions that impress the teachers. And then a Pharisee, this is the other addition, is that a Pharisee tells Mary that she is blessed among women because of him, which is, of course, a connection to whenever Mary is visited by the angel Gabriel, who tells her that she's blessed among women. So yeah, I mean, that's all the big major stuff in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas.
Wow. That's interesting. So what are your thoughts about it? What do you think? Big idea.
Big idea. Yeah. Like I said, I think the major thing about this gospel is it's trying to show Jesus as pre-existent, as divine. I think there is something about him having esoteric knowledge, which would fall in the Gnostic heresy. It's not so explicit about it, but in Gnosticism, not only are they dualistic and they have this view of like spiritual's good, physical is bad, but they're actually called Gnostics because the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis. To know is gnosko. So they believe that you had to have this esoteric knowledge that led to salvation. So I think it's really great that it's emphasizing Jesus's divinity. Like in that sense, it's really good. If it just had the stories about him, bringing water in his cloak and healing James when he gets bitten by a snake and resurrecting kids, I do think it's a little bit funny when the kid falls off the house, and then the parents accuse him, and they're rightfully so based on his track record, to be honest, in this infancy gospel, and then Jesus just resurrects him just to tell him. I think it's kind of like selfish, but yeah, I mean, I'll say, like I said, I like its emphasis on Jesus's divinity, but yeah, and even if it did just have those stories where Jesus is helping people out with divine miracles, extending Joseph's wood longer to help him with work, it's kind of interesting, but it doesn't really add too much. It doesn't give too much character to Jesus, even with just those stories. So yeah, overall, if we're going to give it like an orthodoxy index, personally, I think I'd give it a 6 because it's very significant that Jesus is a perfect person. Like that's super significant, and that he's a loving, caring person. I mean, God is love. Just because it puts so much emphasis and makes it so clear and explicit that Jesus is divine and is the pre-existent God, I feel like I should give it a little bit of a higher score as well. So yeah, what about you? What are your thoughts or takeaways or interesting observations?
Yeah, well, based on what you relayed to me, number one, it's not as spicy as I thought. I thought it was going to be really, I don't know, I thought he was going to do more provocative things. At the same time, yeah, it does put that emphasis on Jesus knowing, like he flexes how much he knows all the time. And they're very insistent that Jesus is divine, but then also I do believe, kind of based on like, what you relayed to me, I get this hint of like that Nestorius kind of view that he doesn't know how to handle that divinity, which I guess by separating his divinity and his humanity, I feel like it kind of undermines his divinity in the first place. Like if he was eternally divine, if Jesus, the one person who I believe to have two natures, was eternally divine, he should feel really comfortable with his divinity, including aspects of his divinity that have to do with his character, to be merciful, gracious, etc. And so, like, if he is Yahweh, who is full of compassion, who's full of patience, I think it's really missing that. Anyway, so with that being said, they didn't get the Trinity wrong. They didn't. There's a lot of heresies that they could have stepped up, or particular beliefs that they could have like jumped on and believed and stuff like that. That it doesn't sound like they messed up on. It seems like they were trying to. They also, Zacchaeus is kind of fun. Like include him. He really only appears in. I think he only appears in Luke, and so we don't really get a whole lot of backstory to him. So it is cool when you get people who show up more than once. But that being said, not a fan. I'd give it about a 4 on the orthodoxy index, just because to miss the character of God, that's a pretty big thing to miss.
Yeah,
So,
that's actually after you said that, I think you made a really good point about the implications of Jesus's divinity for his character and them splitting it. And so I'm actually gonna have to change my score. You persuaded me to change my score. And just like they split the natures of God and how they explained it, I'm going to split 100 score and give them a 5. So yeah, that's our score. But yeah, let us know what y'all thought of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas below. Let us know if you think this should win any awards for as Infancy Gospel, maybe the most surprising. But yeah, with all that said and done, we will see you next week in Babylonia.